it's an opportune time since COP23 is right around the corner. And that's, of course, one of several topics at hand. But I wanted to start with a few loose questions, flow, some juices, and it's a very informal format, so please keep it conversational, interrupt as people wish and need. Some of the all to people's mind are, one of the elephants in the room, Trump administration.
It's an orange elephant.
It's an orange elephant. Okay. We in India don't worry about the color, saffron, orange. You can use any note for this. What has changed? I mean, the declaration of intention to pull out of Paris. So this is something I learned recently. Samantha could maybe just clarify that for those who don't know the nuances of what that means. That's already been with us now for some time. What has that really meant? Has anything really changed on the ground in terms of what other countries think, what commercial spaces think, what investment plans are doing? Is this changing anything? A bigger question, and that's one where India and the US are two of the most important pegs or components of the global picture. Are we on track or off track? And if you want to answer that question, you first ask which track. So what does that mean, and what is India's role within this? I think it's most people would agree that India is not to be blamed for the global climate problem, but India is still part of the future, and what some people think is the solution space, but then the flip question becomes, how much of that burden can be borne by India? Is it even realistic to expect? So even if India does heroic, my God, how amazing levels of change in its trajectories, is that itself going to be enough, for example? Or how does that play out? COP23, Bonn, what are some expectations? What are some focus areas? And last is on sort of India's NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. These targets, not only can we meet them, or are they high or low, those are different discussions, but also the pathways or mechanisms to meeting them. A previous discussion was on renewable energy. So do we need to achieve that many renewables in this time frame to actually meet the NDCs? Or is just the emissions intensity sufficient, then we're on track towards that? And so renewables aren't the question, it's more something else. But a lot of excitement and investment actually seems to be on narrower things than the broader system-wide economy level sorts of issues that really matter. So these are just some questions not directed at anyone in particular, but I would maybe request Samantha to open up with a few thoughts towards any of these questions, or anything, including the weather outside, which is somewhat relevant because it's a air pollution sort of a problem. And having spent time in Beijing, maybe you also have some observations.
Yeah, I won't dwell on the weather. It is definitely a rough air day, and I think this is even worse than some of the rough air days I've seen in Beijing, which is heartbreaking. But I understand that the reasons here are different, and that's not something I'll dwell on. It's not my best area of expertise. What I would like to talk about is the Trump administration and some of the ways we're seeing that play out in the global climate world. President Trump really has a mistrust of multilateralism in general. We're seeing that not just with respect to climate, we're seeing it with respect to trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, potentially NAFTA, the Iran nuclear deal. It's not just with respect to Paris. He really has a distaste for and distrust of multilateralism. But the Paris Agreement is a really important place where this is playing out. And one of the reasons for this is that Paris was a real breakthrough for the world. I mean, it was a completely different way of the global community approaching the climate change problem. And Trump's decision to withdraw really pokes a hole in that. And actually, as an American, I'm more concerned with the way his decision to withdraw affects my country than in the way it affects the rest of the world. And I'll tell you why. The most important thing is I feel like his decision has really painted the US as an unreliable partner in international agreements. If you look around the world, we have many allies, including India, who care deeply about this agreement. And many of these countries are democracies. How the public in these countries feels about the United States and its people is really important to us when we try to exert influence on any number of issues around the world. And so we're in this position now where, why might you trust us? we have shown that perhaps our word may be only as good as the present presidential administration. And so that, as an American, is really troubling to me. But I want to point out some reasons why Trump's decisions to withdraw may not be quite as bad as it might look on its face. One thing that I'd like to point out is that state and local governments and also companies in the US are still quite focused on the Paris Agreement. There are a number of pledges, I think David might have a number actually, of subnational policies and pledges that are happening around the United States. And some of the most important policies that make a difference in greenhouse gas emissions are actually at the state and local level. There's certain things that the federal government can uniquely do, but not everything. I'd also like to point out on the corporate level and the investment level that energy companies typically are making decisions that have very long lifetimes. We're talking about investments of 20, 30, or 40 years. And so when you think about a 4-year Trump administration, that's actually quite a short length of time when you're considering energy investments. And so in talks that I've heard from energy executives and conversations that I've had, they're not generally changing their investment strategy in response to the Trump administration or his decision to pull out of Paris. And so that's something that I find very comforting. And I'll answer the question that Rahul brought up at the beginning real quick before I pass the mic. And that is that there's actually a delay before the US can pull out of the Paris Agreement. And completely coincidentally, it's right around the time of the next presidential election when the US is actually able to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Right now, we're still in the agreement. We have a negotiating crew in Bonn at COP23 now. This is largely made up of somewhat lower level people within the State Department, but the good news on that is that these are people who've done these negotiations before. So I expect that the US delegation there, we won't be leaders the way that we have been in the past, but I expect that we'll be constructive people within the negotiation, and that's also something that I'm quite grateful for.
Thank you.
I don't have particular hopes for or expectations for the current negotiations. When the Paris Agreement was adopted, they also adopted a list of things that needed to be done to complete the Paris Agreement, and that list is almost as long as the Paris Agreement itself, and that's normal. And so they're working through the list, and this meeting is part of the working through the list process. Next year's meeting will be more important. Certainly this meeting will turn out to be important if some countries get really angry and leave, or say mean things at each other and so on. That's always a possibility. But my expectation is that everybody knows what the game is, and that they're going to go there, they're going to do whatever work they can do, and leave and pretend to be friendly to each other. And so I think this will be largely a non-event. I think I agree with Samantha that the effect for a few years of the United States announcing it's going to withdraw, that effect is not, it's not huge, it's not good. It's important to have the United States in agreements like this. Historically, the country's played a very constructive role in lots of areas, and so this is not good. But the genius of the Paris Agreement is that it was supposed to be more flexible and give countries the ability to set their own commitments. And one of the benefits of that, explicit benefits of that, was to make the agreement less brittle, so that if one country leaves or one country does crazy things, that the rest of the thing doesn't come crumbling down. And we are now seeing a test of that brittleness hypothesis, and I think it's doing well. I don't think Syria has joined as a result of that, but it'll do fine. And there are some evidence that some places are doing more work. Samantha mentioned the state and local initiatives. You may know the exact number, Navroz, but I think there are 12,500 initiatives announced under the so-called NASCA portal, which are different state and local and other initiatives. So there's a lot of stuff happening. Let me add a footnote. There's a lot of people saying they're going to do things. The amount of doing is yet to be seen. I would say the ratio of talking to doing remains very high. And that, I think, is the key question. I think for us as analysts, it's actually the key question, is where and how do these different state and local initiatives, where do they matter? And partly that's a technical question. Where do state and local, provincial, corporate initiatives, where do they have leverage on the problem? and where do they actually have an incentive to go off and do something that's different that affects overall emissions. And so I think that's analytically a really hard but interesting question. But I think I would expect to see a lot of scholarship in this area. This is a very important issue. The last thing I'll say, just by way of opening comments, is you asked whether we are on target or on track. And so
Which
I guess,
track?
So I guess, yeah, to paraphrase Bill Clinton in a very different context, it depends on what you mean by the words "on" and "track." There were ambitious goals announced in Paris that were actually goals people have been talking about for a long time, well below 2 degrees, above pre-industrial levels. My own view is that goal is not achievable. I've written a lot about that. I think actually codifying goals in terms of globally average temperature is, as a scientist, the wrong way to do it, and politically is also the wrong way to do it. So I think that's I understand the political reasons for setting ambitious goals. At some point, reality is going to need to intrude on that conversation. And so we're not on track for that. What's more disturbing to me is that all of the advanced industrialized countries are not on track to meet their own pledges they made. There's a paper that a group of us had in Nature in early August about that. That to me is very worrisome, not because the numerical targets matter, but because the whole logic behind Paris was that everybody's free to go off and do more or less whatever they want to do, and then every once in a while we review that and see how the progress is working. Some people call that pledge and review. Some people call that bottom up, although it's not really fully bottom up because there's still a role for review and for the center and for direction. That's a hypothesis. And so if we don't do very well in building the review mechanisms, and we don't have volunteer countries to come forward and say, come review me, as the United States and China did under the G20 for fossil fuel subsidies phase out, as an example. And we have all of the industrialized countries that are expected, as they should be on the lead for reducing emissions, failing to implement what they said they would do, then that to me is a very, very big concern. So I think the framework remains kind of flexible, malleable, but we could easily still look back on this process as Paris was an interesting start in a new direction and a hopeful one, but it didn't actually have much impact on the underlying behavior. And that, I think, that remains to be seen, but that's my concern right now.
So just a couple of observations, and I'd like to comment on the Trump issue, but before that, observation about Paris itself. I think it's important to project what some of the Indian debates around Paris have been. I think Samantha mentioned that it really was seen as a breakthrough, and there are some people here who do view it as a breakthrough. There was also a lot of skepticism around Paris, right, in India. There was a lot of sense in which, in order to come to an agreement, that Paris really defanged the entire process. So the critique was, look, we don't have any really strong safeguards for India's priority concern of equity and thinking about burden sharing and so on and so forth, because for the reasons David mentioned, that's not how Paris was set up. Another way of looking at it is, you've dealt with equity and burden sharing implicitly because every country gets to do what it wants. So India doesn't have to actually compromise on anything on its development objectives, because you can always put whatever is in your development interests. So that's kind of the way in which Paris was set up. But because of the skepticism among some folks, the potential withdrawal or the announcement by the US takes on an additional resonance, right? Because it basically says, okay, we bent over backwards to come up with this construct that was flexible, in part with an eye to keeping the US in. And even that wasn't enough, potentially, to keep the US in. So the question is, how far is the world willing to go to have the US be part of this process? And in that sort of framing, my own view is actually, I'm not that unhappy that President Trump made the announcement he did. Because in a sense, it put an end to this kind of slippery slope logic. And at least we've left the door open that a future US administration would come back in, that you have a floor on the process as it is now, that you don't actually have further concessions. And in the backdrop to the Trump announcement, there was a lot of discussion in the US, particularly among US NGOs, among some US NGOs, that basically said, Paris doesn't really bind us. We don't have to walk away. We can do what we want. And in particular, we can revise our nationally determined contribution downwards if we need to. And that, fortunately, to my mind, that point of view didn't prevail. Because if that point of view had prevailed, then the pledge and review construct is built on one important premise, which is no backsliding. Right? This is a ratchet mechanism. So a country announces, and then you can only move up. Now, the negotiators in the US have always been very clever. They've always left all kinds of loopholes. So technically, according to the language, it potentially left the door open to this kind of revision downward of an NDC. But there's sort of a legal debate going on, and at least some of the colleagues that I have at CPR, who are quite well-known international law scholars, suggest that if you read that text in the spirit of the larger agreement, I'd be curious what David thinks about this, it would in fact be counter that spirit of the agreement. So the point I'm trying to make is an interpretation of the Paris Agreement that said countries are allowed to go so far as to actually revise downward their nationally determined contribution would in fact render this agreement completely meaningless. I think if we have a context where you say you put an NDC up there and then you have to ratchet upwards, there's no particular obligation, it's more a process of global suasion, it's a process of enabling national politics, at least you're headed in the right direction. But if you have no guarantee of being headed in the right direction, then we don't really have anything to work with. And I was extremely disappointed to see some friends in the US, people in the environmental community, who are willing to actually, in a sense, completely gut the agreement to that extent, as in allowing backsliding on NDCs in order to keep the US in. To me, that would be a price that would be too high. And I'd actually see some positives in the way that both Samantha and David mentioned. You see an upsurge of activism and of organizing in the US. You see all the foundations who are actually quite important sort of pulling their money, frankly, I think it's a good thing, from the rest of the world and plowing it back into the US to try and shift US politics. And I think all of those are things that actually need to happen. So I think ultimately it could lead to a more focused and progressive US politics around climate change. And if that's the case, that's sort of the positive spin on this. But that would only be true, as I said, if this issue isn't revisited. And it's a question to both of you. Is there still some discussion about revisiting the NDC? Because that would really, or rather, the US administration staying in and using sort of a lower NDC as the basis to do that.
So I think these are very important questions. So let me just, a little backstory here. Navroz and I were on the IPCC together for about 150 years.
At least,
it feels like it. It might have been only 4. Feels like 150 years. And so we've had a chance to talk about these issues for a long time, and weather the experience of getting the summary for policymakers more or less hacked to death during the plenary negotiations in Berlin in 2014. And I've always learned a lot from listening to Navroz. And in particular, one of the things that really impresses me is how a single agreement can be read in so many different ways around the world. So from the American point of view, a key virtue of this is the flexibility, and I can completely understand that from an Indian point of view, this is seen as caving. I guess I have a different kind of perspective on 2 aspects of this. One is, I don't think it's only the Americans that wanted an agreement that was more bottom-up and more flexible. I know the Chinese, for example. I mean, we've got to think about an agreement that engages countries that have lots of different motivations for working on the climate problem while working on other problems. And that was true also in China. And one almost Machiavellian way to see the bilateral US-China announcement that was made in the fall of 2014, a year before Paris, was this was an effort by those 2 countries to announce what they were going to do to constrain the range of outcomes that could happen in Paris, to almost guarantee, with consent of the French government and a lot of others, that you'd have a more flexible, bottom-up kind of approach. The issue of the pledges, I think, is very important. So the one way of reading the agreement is that this is a ratcheting agreement where you make pledges and then you only go forward. It's like a shark. It can only swim forward, and if it stops swimming, it dies. My read of the agreement, and there's a big debate among public international lawyers about this, my read of the agreement is different. That the agreement, to put different language in it, the agreement is an experimentalist agreement. It's an agreement where countries and firms and NGOs all know they need to do something about the climate problem and control emissions. Many of those actions are going to be pursued not just because people are concerned about climate change, but they're concerned about local air pollution, energy security, and so on. So there's now an overwhelming agreement on the need to do that. The problem is how and what. And so in that world, if you think about this as an experimentalist agreement, you should expect to see ratcheting forward or backwards. And to the extent that you don't allow movement in both directions, if you like, then you're guaranteeing that the pledges, the NDCs, are going to be conservative and are going to be quite often far removed from what governments are actually trying to do. And the whole idea here is to create incentives to go off and experiment and try things and reveal what's working and what's not working. So I recognize completely there's a debate about whether that's the logic of the agreement versus a ratcheting forward logic. But by that logic, I don't have as many problems with a revision of the US NDC. And I think, frankly, Japan is going to need to think about revising its NDC. I'm very skeptical the EU is going to meet its NDC. I think there's a serious problem. Actually, all the advanced industrial democracies are under such pressure to look like they're doing something about climate change that they've all made pledges that they can't actually honor. So that's my take reading the agreement as a political scientist who does a lot of work in public international law. But where I do agree with Navroz is I think the effort by the NGOs in the United States to almost pander to the Trump administration to say, look, you just need to adjust this and so on, that was crazy, that administration, this administration, is almost impossible to engage with. I heard the other day that in the Trump administration, the noise is the signal. So the idea is you just have kind of chaos all the time, and so long as you don't accidentally plunge the world into nuclear war, then that's going to be fine. I think that's an irresponsible way to conduct a foreign policy. One normally doesn't go to other countries and criticize your own government, but here I am doing this, not as an official of the US government. And I think that's an irresponsible way to operate. And so to pander to that, as opposed to forcing them to be accountable for what is basically a reckless series of foreign policy actions, I don't agree with that pandering. But I do think the underlying logic, which is an experimentalist logic, we need to recognize that in reality means that if you try experiments and you try difficult things, some of them are going to work and others are not going to work.
Do you mind if I just...
Navroz is now going to defend the Trump administration. We have a complete reversal of roles.
and cogently,
this is bizarro world for some of you who will catch the reference.
I want to sort of set the record straight actually on one thing, which is that I actually count myself among the relatively few voices in India that thought Paris was a good idea, and had actually written about this direction for the Paris Agreement in 2010, the year after Copenhagen, saying this is the only way in which this thing is going to work itself out. The problem I had was that in order to convince other people in India that this is a good idea, there are a certain set of minimal conditions, right? And those minimal conditions are at risk of unraveling here in India, and I suspect in other countries too. So the credibility of this model depends, I think, on a few of those conditions. And among them, I think, is actually the forward motion. I agree this is experimental, but we can't be experimenting towards multiple objectives at the same time. You can't be experimenting on how to recarbonize your economy. The idea is to experiment towards decarbonizing your economy, right? And in terms of the incentives to have, so David made this argument, which many of us have, which David, I think, originally made, but others have, including myself, have followed, which is that the more top-down construct almost guaranteed that you would have very, very conservative targets, right? Because you're just going to negotiate to have as little a piece of the problem to deal with yourself. But the idea behind this pledge construct was supposedly to liberate countries to be a little bit more forward-looking. And the quid pro quo that allowed them to do that was not, I think, being able to move backwards, but the fact that you have very weak compliance mechanisms, effectively no compliance mechanisms. That was what was supposed to allow countries to experiment, not, I think, the backward-looking. If you have the ability to step back, then I think then I think every political battle you win is easily then rolled back. So I would agree with the thought process that it's experimental and so on, but I would say the design to achieve that is pledges plus weak compliance, not pledges plus the ability to roll back.
Yeah, and I would say, and I'm going to let Samantha get in here, I would say that for those reasons, my guess is that no government is going to roll back its pledge, actually, that even governments that don't meet them are just going to move beyond. And so that's okay. What I think really matters, one of the things I can say in many Indian meetings is I've listened to a very large diversity of ringtones. What I will say is that this question of credibility is vital. And international law works mainly through credibility. And so if we don't start having facts on the ground,
Yep.
where firms do things, where governments do things, luckily, frankly, federal policy mostly doesn't matter in this area. I mean, there's a few areas where it matters a lot, but the states are more important in the United States. If we don't start seeing real changes on the ground, then I think people are going to raise questions about credibility. Samantha?
I'll add a quick point about some things that Trump has said on the issues of credibility and of backsliding. One thing that President Trump said in his quite destructive speech announcing that he was withdrawing from the agreement, but one of the things he's pointed out, he thought this agreement was very unfair to the United States. He said that he would consider re-entering if it could be renegotiated under better terms. That's crazy talk, and I think everyone in this room knows that somehow renegotiating the Paris Agreement to make it more favorable to the United States is not going to happen. But you hear some talk amongst people I know in the States and in the environmental community that perhaps Trump's pulling out isn't the worst thing that could have happened. And in part because of what Navroz is saying about not backsliding. Perhaps it's better that the U.S. pulled out rather than pulling back on its NDC, or rather than staying in and being somewhat destructive in the negotiations. As it is, because it's somewhat downplayed in the administration, they've sent lower level but constructive people to the COP. And so I was certainly heartbroken when the U.S. pulled out and did a lot of speaking and writing about it at the time. But as I've reflected on it, I don't think it's necessarily the worst thing that could have happened, because it is preventing this administration from poisoning the agreement in some of the ways that Navroz has described.
So, I mean, no, I have a, yes.
Part of the elite, part of the 1%.
Not in carbon emissions, though, or money. So I'll leave you for guessing where. I mean, we heard the growth of subnational in the United States, and Navroz, you've spent a lot of time thinking about subnational issues, for example, with discoms. So, do you see the subnational conversation happening in India? If not, and let's separate just the electricity side to the broader emissions and carbon side. And they're not necessarily the same. But if I think about where the headlines, the money, the oxygen all flows, it seems to be towards electricity and discoms a lot, and RE. The RE story seems to get a lot of the headlines, but that's not the only instrument or lever on the table. So both thoughts about how we untangle these, or the subnational story in India?
Yeah, I want to pick up on something that David said when he talked about the NASCA initiatives and so on. And there are many 1,000 plus of these out there. Many of these are, in fact, a way of representing a lot of sort of city level, state level, subnational, corporate, individual companies, and so on. One of the challenges with that is not only, as David said, will they have how much is talk, how much is action, but how much of those are additional to what is an NDC versus how much of them are actually embedded in an NDC. This then gets us into a game of arithmetic. And I think too much, frankly, and this is one of the reasons I was critical of the earlier story around climate negotiations, and I'm actually a fan of the experimental sort of learn as you go approach, is that we spend a lot of time and energy thinking about this adding up question, which then actually distracted, which then led to a lot of time and energy going into how you game the adding up question, and not enough to creating facts on the ground. So I think that the challenge really is that sort of creating facts on the ground point. That is what is going to give momentum, because the hope is that in 2022, I think, is when the stock take is supposed to happen. The global stock take is that part of the top-down mechanism that David said, where you sit and you sort of add things up and you see where you are, and countries are urged to take on updated pledges. The hope is that every country will find that it's actually not that difficult, that it's not that expensive, that it's actually okay, that industry has come around in your country, constituencies have come around, politics has changed, and therefore it's okay to take on more ambitious pledges. That's the hope. For that to happen, you don't have to win the adding up game, you have to win the facts on the ground game. So I think that's actually a really important, and I think there's probably agreement in this panel on that point. In India, the facts on the ground story is a bit muddled by 2 or 3 things. One, climate change is simply not high enough as a factor to drive national politics and policy as a primary driver. We have, when you look at climate change, you have the probability of a particular action being associated with the climate forces. This is now very interesting new scientific literature which is called weather attribution. They actually put a probability number that a particular event is tied to climate change. So there's some probability multiplied by, oftentimes, some sort of growing impact over time. So in 10, 20, 30 years, maybe the impacts will become truly problematic. Maybe they already are upon us. But you juxtapose that in India with a situation like the problem of open defecation, right? Where we know it is having a huge impact socially on India and Indians. There's stunting of Indian children as a result of this. It's a very hard problem to solve. That's happening with more or less 100% probability. We keep the windows closed here for a good reason. That's another 100% probability outcome. So there's lots of immediate things that are going to crowd out climate change. Where climate change can come in is as an additional sort of thumb on the scale. So it's this sort of co-benefit story that many of us have been talking about, that a lot of times air pollution, energy security, and climate change can be solved with similar sorts of policies. And these are actually synergistic outcomes. So that argument resonates much better. But what you actually do with it tangibly requires technical skills, administrative skills, and tools that allow you to then aggregate the benefits from a particular policy along these at least 3, if not more, dimensions. And that's something that some of us are working towards. Just a second quick comment and then I'll stop. The second comment is the reason perhaps it's not, we're not seeing that much going on at the subnational level is a lot of this is being driven by framings from outside India, right? So there's lots of networks, the C40 network, there's ICLEI, and so on and so forth, and they are often constrained by a framing that wants to project climate change as an immediate existential challenge, as a very high, and that doesn't fly, that doesn't play. So you go into a city like Rajkot, where we've been doing some work, it's a second-tier city in Gujarat, and you go to corporators and you go to the municipal commissioner and you try and get corporators to think about action driven by climate change. And if you go to any second-tier Indian city, that's just not going to be the number one thing you think about. Right? So the framings of this by international networks, sometimes by donor agency, are not entirely productive all of the time. One of the directions in which they're growing, of growing productivity is that a lot of the actions are now around adaptation, which does actually ring true with a lot of people, a lot of communities.
Let me just say that, just on this quickly, I think this picture that most people are not motivated first and foremost by concerns about climate change is not unique to India. So Bruce Jones at Brookings and I have a paper coming out in the next month or so. It's the first in a whole series of papers on rethinking the geopolitics of energy and climate change. And this first paper is about where does diplomacy matter and where doesn't diplomacy matter. And one of the things we try to do in that paper quantitatively is show what fraction of world emissions comes from places where the primary motivation for the policy is concern about global climate change. And it's fraught with methodological problems, and so those of you who are methodologists will send us lots of rude email about how we did it wrong, and that's great, please do that, help us do it better next time. But what's interesting is that maybe a quarter or maybe a fifth of world emissions comes from those jurisdictions. It's true also in the United States. So the coasts of the United States tend to be politically more progressive than the interior parts of the country, and the coasts are maybe a quarter of US emissions, maybe a little more, but they're already starting to do things to try and control emissions, and so they're in some ironic sense becoming a smaller part of the overall problem. And a lot of the emissions in the country come from parts of the country that are worried about other things as well. And so I think this is the new reality of the politics of climate change, is that for most of the world, it's about this as an adder, and about how do you add this as an adder in a way that results in smart policy.
I mean, your point about adaptation is spot on, because I can name lots of cities where either air pollution or flooding are two of the highest priority issues. But the flip side of that is, of course, it's not necessarily fair to blame a lot of that on climate change, because it's really bad planning, zoning, and even to the extent of corruption in terms of land development and who's building where. If you're building on a lake bed, I'm sorry, you will get flooded. So there's these issues.
But that is the essence of what makes this, on the one hand, a hard problem, but on the other hand, if we start to think about it in politically more astute ways, it makes the solution set easier, because almost all of the emission reduction efforts, at least up to a point, at some point we're going to need to act for climate policy for climate policy's sake, but we're so far from that. Let's just focus on today, right now. Almost all the effort in controlling emissions and almost all the effort in adaptation overlaps heavily with other things you'd want to do. And so one of the most important adaptive measures, for example, is to help farmers with crop early forecasting. You would want to do that for a lot of reasons, and then that also helps with on the adaptation front.
So, I mean, coming to a thread that I've heard a lot, Navroz, you're talking about 2022, for example, is when we'll see, oh wow, it's actually not as tough as we thought. That's one of the hopes some folks have. And the flip side of that is, if technology improves to making a lot of this stuff no regrets, you don't need a Paris, you don't need a climate change framework. Hey, this is the cheapest, best, win-win-win sort of situation. Then we're in much better shape. But a lot of the energy space is not about win-win-win, but trade-offs, winners and losers and things like that. So India and much of the world has relied on technological fixes to these problems. So solar was one of them. Now batteries are part of it. EVs are another part, with a lot of co-benefits, of course. But it's not clear if you can technologically innovate yourself out of this problem or even regulate yourself out of this problem. Samantha?
I've talked about this issue in front of a number of audiences and people at different levels of thought and coming from different spaces. And I often find myself pointing out, and some people find this crass and other people find it obvious, but once solutions become economic, you can't stop people doing them. And so I tend to close everything I do and everything I talk about with pointing out that what you need is investments in technology and investments in technology research. This is an obvious place for government to work. There aren't necessarily the right incentives for private companies to invest sufficiently in very basic science and technology research. Another thing that it's worth pointing out is you talked about you can't regulate your way out of this. You can't subsidize your way out of this. If you look at the size of the global energy system, it's just too big for any government to be able to push this transition by itself. I mean, you think of the different steps that you go from shallow to deep decarbonization. These early phases, you have a lot of co-benefits and you can focus on that. As you get further along, you're going to need new technologies, but we need to think now about making those investments that we're going to need down the road. And so you need to think about this as a sort of a continuum of things that you need to do and focus on what you can do now and then focus on the technologies that you may need for the future. But yeah, thinking that we're going to quickly subsidize or regulate our way out of the problem is not a great way to think.
Yeah, if I could just come in on that. I think the discussion, as David said, it's important not to think about, David made the point that the sort of this co-benefits adder logic is true in a lot of countries, and I think that's right. But there are other ways in which I think different countries face questions that are quite different, and there are a lot of relatively easier wins in India because we haven't locked into a lot of patterns, right? And I think that a lot of those things are not actually about technology. The answers are kind of known. A lot of the challenges are actually institutional. So, for example, how we design our cities, how we design our freight corridors, how we design our buildings. All of these are going to, how we design our electricity system, whether it takes into account the shift towards renewable energy or not. All of these things actually are potentially, I hate the phrase, but it's true, sort of a win-win kind of co-benefits like outcome. And what is important is for India to actually seize those opportunities as best we can, not just for climate and not primarily for climate reasons, for all these other reasons we've talked about. And one of the problems with the earlier logic of the climate discussion was that China took exactly the opposite path. China basically locked itself into a high carbon, high coal system from 2005-ish or 2001 really, up to about 2015 when it was just growing crazily in order to have a huge amount of headroom. And then they announced, we're done, right? And it's worked. China is now seen diplomatically as the global leader and substantively, and its emissions have increased by an enormous magnitude in the last 15 years. The risk in India is we look at that and we think, well, that worked pretty well for them. Maybe we should do something similar, right? And I think it's incumbent on us, certainly us here, to argue that that would be self-defeating. And this is where I want to pick up on Samantha's point. I think we were headed down the track of saying, let's try and defend as much space as we can for coal, even though we don't know if we need it, until the prices seemingly flipped. Once the prices changed, then the argument really was hard to sustain. But I think where I want to go with this is that there's a bunch of things on the demand and infrastructure side, the physical structure of your economy, that I think are going to be really, really big gains for a country like India, and we should spend a good amount of time thinking about those.
So now the fact that we all have mics now, so people can now jump in. We don't have to share, so no, please don't necessarily ask me to jump in, so please do. You talked about we can't regulate ourselves, and I think people would tend to agree. One of the instruments that's been talked of, it's not quite like global cold fusion, fusion, it's just coming tomorrow, but carbon prices, carbon markets, how do we see that playing out? Is that going to help, at least in pockets? Because there's going to be more regional growth of that as opposed to more structural, forget global sort of prices. India keeps talking about having a carbon tax, but that's a de facto style carbon tax. It's not really a carbon tax. So if you do the math, they use a 400 rupees per ton excess on coal, for example. But for CO2, I think that's only about what, my colleagues will correct me, I'm sure, $3.50.
Closer to 5.
I mean, depends on certain assumptions, but it's quite low, actually. So what do folks think about? So it's not just taxes, there's markets, trading, what else? So what are the other new instruments, or what are things we could or should look for or think about?
Well, I don't know if there's going to be a magic wand there. I will say that a lot of my colleagues are enthusiastic about using market-based instruments. This is a big debate we had in the IPCC. And I love the idea of a carbon tax. It sends a clean signal, it's reliable, done properly, it generates huge revenues. The revenues can be used for other political purposes, can wash the dishes at the same time, like solves all problems. I don't see a lot of jurisdictions being able to do that. I see more jurisdictions doing cap and trade systems. A lot of people like to think that they're the same. They're actually very much not the same. Most cap and trade systems are set up so that they are layered on top of existing regulatory instruments. And so what happens is the regulatory instruments do all the work, if you like, and then what gets traded is whatever's left over. And so what's traded is residual. And it's not surprising that then all these cap and trade systems have prices that are very low, because they're not trading the real marginal effort, they're trading the residual. Why is that? And I used to think for a long time that's just because not enough policymakers went to our classes and studied. They were all out drinking or doing whatever they're not supposed to be doing and so on. But I've come to the conclusion that it's actually because they're geniuses. They understand that everything that we as economically trained academics like about market instruments, they're transparent, they allow competition and so on, is distasteful to somebody who's politically powerful. You don't want to have a lot of transparency quite often. You don't want to have perfect competition between different energy sources because you want the renewables to win, or you want the coal to win, or you want the nuclear to win, or you want your mother-in-law to win, or whatever it is. And so I think we are in a situation where the politics of the problem are going to lead us to use a lot more regulation and non-market instruments than would be optimal. And for that same reason, all this talk, I've become increasingly skeptical about this linking of different cap and trade systems, I can understand the logic of how you might want to link different cap and trade systems, because that eventually would create a more global international system. But if you think that the rules in each different jurisdiction are going to be different because the politics are different, then there's no way to link the systems, because the underlying value of the currency, if you like, think about this as inventing money and Gresham's law, the underlying value of the currency is different in each of the different markets. So I think this is an area where, frankly, a lot of academic advice has been just deeply misleading, not about what might be an ideal outcome, but what's likely to actually happen. And that tells me that we're actually going to see a lot of good old-fashioned regulation. It might well be that the net cost of all this is going to be a lot lower than we expect because of innovation. And so people forget that in the early days of the Montreal Protocol and the ozone layer, that looked like a really hard problem that was going to cost a lot of money. And then, for accidental reasons, fairly quickly people looked to substitutes and alternatives and so on. They found a lot, and so the cost came down and the politics followed very quickly. I don't think structurally energy's like that, but it might be.
So just to pick up on that point, you mentioned that there's a residual is what carbon often plays at. And so if we look at the Indian, just to use electricity as one big subset of this entire space, we don't yet even have well-developed institutions in the electricity space. So when India says that we're bidding for power plants, they're not bidding for the electricity, they're bidding for the power plant. And those are two very different sort of bidding sort of outcomes. So you've got distortions in how electricity is procured. Below the electricity, you've got distortions in how the coal is procured, and so forth and so forth. So it's unclear, maybe you folks have some views. Is this a problem that you can only solve if you solve all of them together, which then makes it that much harder to solve? Or if you do it incrementally, then by the time you're done and you solve it at the end, it is much harder to do it piecemeal. And you should have actually put in the effort to do it all at once. There's two different schools of thought towards that.
Well, if I understand the question correctly, I mean, I don't think one necessarily, incidentally, the current mantra at the COP is nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So they're actually taking the one of the which is, of course, going to be mean the negotiations are in for a hard 2 weeks. Yeah. So I don't think that necessarily is an approach that we have to be bound to, at least looking at the situation in India. For one, I think that just coming back to the earlier discussion about regulation versus markets and so on and so forth, I think in India, because you're looking at a lot of future infrastructure lock-in with a very large public signal role, it may actually not only be, it may be necessary to actually have a regulation and policy-led approach to get some of those things to happen. Many of those things may not happen just with market signals. In other words, even if you set up a carbon market here, that's certainly no guarantee, unless it's very, very cleverly set up, that you're going to build rail freight versus road freight, for example. That's like a straight policy decision. So those big lumpy things are, you need to have sensible policy signaling and regulation to drive that. In terms of taking the example of the electricity sector, I mean, I think the way we have to think about this is, as I said in my question at the end of the last session, we got sort of next century's problems and last century's problems kind of overlapping. And we need to think very sensibly about whether the new technologies, in what areas will they exacerbate the old problems, in what areas will they help compensate for them, and where will they just bypass them, right? And then you have sort of three buckets to think about, and you'd actually work differently depending on your answer ex ante as to whether it will do one of those, which of those three things will what sort of interaction will happen between those. So I think we have to sort of think through what we're trying to achieve and what the likely interactions are, and then design your policy instruments around it, right? So I think we often think of the policy instrument as the end. It should be a means to some end, right? We have to figure out what that transition path is, and then harness your policy instruments sensibly to get us from point A to point B.
Yeah, just saying that, oh look, we've got a good carbon market it's a means to an end at best.
That's right.
So, I mean, is it just an issue that the signaling may not be enough with such a mechanism? So is there a carbon price that could actually say no trucking, but let's build out more railways? Because the Clean Air Act had emissions markets in the US that started higher and then just fell. Look at carbon prices in Europe today. I think they're very low. So is it just that those are doomed to stay low?
None of the issue is when you build the roads and when you build the tracks. That's not going to be driven by a carbon market.
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, these system-wide behavior tends not to be, it's about system-level planning, and the idea behind the markets is to create incentives for individuals to behave differently. I mean, yes, you could have the Norwegian carbon tax, for example, is a good. There's a lot of stuff happening in Norway that is incented by that carbon tax and a whole set of other ancillary policies that are market-driven. It's a market with a giant hammer hitting people over the head, but you have a tremendous deployment of electric vehicles.
But that's not just because of carbon pricing.
Not just because of carbon
yeah.
pricing. You have the world's leader in carbon capture and storage. You have now, with additional government support, a project in Western Norway to gather carbon dioxide from industrial sources and then collect that and sequester it underground. So there's all kinds of things that are the technologies you would think would be important to address the climate problem that you could imagine coming in with a market signal like that. It's just that that's very rare to observe.
I'm going to open it up to questions because last time we didn't quite get through a lot of questions. And then before closing, we'll come back to our panelists for sort of what next, what's missing, or wish lists, or all of the above. If we could, if I could actually start behind the gentleman at his hand, then next one. Yes, a couple of
my question is Samantha.
Sorry, could you use the mic and introduce yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Navroz. I used to work as an engineer. My question to Samantha, the process of political decision making in the US, we are it's opaque to us. So the way you came forward in the explanation and the way all diplomats do, and also the administration, and what's happening on ground, you said that people are supporting, states are supporting the climate action program.
Some states, I guess.
Some states, yeah, especially California. So can you just elaborate on the political decision making, how that happens, and some insights into that aspects of the Trump administration?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I mean, one important thing to think about when you're looking from the outside in to the U.S. system and the U.S. administration is what the Trump administration itself can do as the executive, and then what you need approval from Congress to do, and what other parts of the government can do. So when you look at things like international agreements, Trump has the ability to say yes or no to those kinds of agreements, and that's why he's able to unilaterally say, I'd like to pull the U.S. out of Paris. If you look to some other things that are happening, for instance, there's a real push in the U.S. against regulation. This administration is very skeptical of regulation of all forms, particularly of energy regulation and of fossil fuels. That's a bit more difficult. The executive can't necessarily unilaterally change things. If you want to pull a regulation, which this administration wants to do in many cases, you have to go through the same process that you did when you put it in place, which requires scientific study, it requires public comment. And so there are things that this administration would like to do that it cannot because of the checks and balances, either through the administrative process or through Congress. And so that's something from the outside that I think is worth looking at, that even if there are things that President Trump wants to do, he has some ability to do things, unilaterally with the stroke of pen, and other things he needs support from different parts, or there are longer term processes that have to take place. And so that sort of answers why some of the things you're seeing in the United States are happening right away, and other things that we know this president would like to do, but that aren't necessarily within his power to do right away.
And then, could you wait for the mic just 1 second?
First problem is
If you could, sir, limit it to one question, and then we'll come back to you.
Yeah. Most of the stakeholders, they find it difficult adopting the clean procedures. They find it very expensive, impractical, inconvenient, and lack of awareness and accountability, responsibility, compliance, enforcement, lack of regulations and incentives. For example, tobacco industry, for getting them complying for the nicotine, they were 100 years to make them comply.
Yeah, so I don't think that is true. I just have to disagree completely with the question. There are going to be some industries where this will be difficult, but to me what's really interesting is how many firms in different industries recognize that are involved in emissions, recognize that there are needs for change, and that in some companies this is existential. Oil and gas companies, coal companies. 12 days ago I was in London at the annual CEO level get-together of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. So this does not include the American oil and gas companies right now, because all the West European oil and gas companies, include Saudi Aramco. It's about to include ADNOC, Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. These are firms that recognize if they don't have a credible answer to the question of what they're doing with their product, that might be existential for the firm. For better or for worse, the palm oil industry has now been through that process. A lot of other industries that are involved in indirectly or directly deforestation are going through that process. The effect of firms looking at things like Paris and saying, this is credible, it has problems and so on, but it's credible. The effect of that is to move climate from being a corporate social responsibility topic to being a topic that is strategic, that is C-suite. And that to me is very interesting. I think the rates of change are going to be much faster than we saw in the tobacco industry. This is going to be hard in some places. There are going to be a lot of places where people are going to discover things that are much easier. We've seen, for example, the revolution in decentralized energy and renewable energy and battery storage. All of that's making things in the utility business much easier and less expensive than people originally thought. So I think that's actually the big news here, and not so much the difficulty of all of it.
Can I just jump in on that for a second? I think the interesting kernel sort of in this discussion between the question and David is what is sort of the underlying approach to regulation, right? So I think perhaps the question has in mind some of the challenges about ensuring industries stick to local water effluent regulations or local ed, and in that sense, I think you're right. The compliance has been very weak, and in a sense, what David is pointing out is this sea change that has occurred, and perhaps it speaks to sort of the way in which we approach regulation, and maybe these kinds of shifts that include entire normative shifts and shifting the economics of a whole industry are much more effective than the slap on the wrist approach to regulation, which is much more incremental.
Yeah.
And it's so both are perhaps partially true if you look at it in those
There's
ways.
a famous paper in the field of industrial organization, kind of created the field of industrial organization, by George Stigler in 1971, which is about why is it that so many firms actually want regulation? You expect the firms, they don't want to be regulated. And it's about barriers to entry and protection of market share and so on. And a dark way of viewing what's happening right now is that Stigler's back, and that firms are trying to figure out how they stay alive and basically take over some of the functions we used to attribute to government, or get themselves organized and then get government to go do that. And I don't know if that's good news or bad news, but I think it's news.
So I'm going to go back to the topic, the beginning, climate change. And to me, climate change is not COP23. Frankly, I agree with David, it's quite irrelevant right now, what's happening. And the other one is late 2017 world. What is different today, as even a year ago, is that the politics are different, the economics are different, and perhaps, let's say geopolitics and governance is different both in the US and here. So I think we could spend a little time in the, climate change in India, as well as I believe in the US, and all the things leading to Paris, etc., were a subject basically of elite politics. And that is why Trump pretty much took, and it resonated with a lot of people. I agree with, I'll stop with the commentary, but with Navroz, I've tried to talk to people in states, even in Delhi, beyond a very thin veneer of people who are in the conference circuit. Neither energy policy nor any other policy is actually, climate change does not figure. At most, it's a greenwash on top. In America, now let me come back, what was amazing to me at one level, and this is where the silver lining might be, that I was 3 weeks ago at the Behavioral Economics Climate Change Conference in Sacramento. I was amazed at the level of, first, no talk at all about COP, but a tremendous surge of energy at community level and sort of local level initiatives and actions and et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, so that's the good news. The bad news was it was totally confined to the two coasts. There were people from the middle, but they were all bemoaning the fact that nothing was happening in the so-called heartland. So my question to you is, in America, how does the political polarization, in the end, will it be plus or minus? Secondly, just in that, the bureaucratic politics is not, what Trump is doing and others, it's not what he is doing on policy, but how he's gutting the capacity of certain institutions. And I'm not just talking about EPA, I'm talking about SEC, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in India, I'm wondering when renewables came about, at that time, it was extremely, economically, some would argue, even an irrational decision. But Mr. Modi and the previous government decided that that was the way to go. Today, given where we are, where the agenda has shifted, how has the politics changed, given the economics has, on the other hand, moved favorably? So I think the world today is 1 year very different, both in America and in India. And I'm wondering, how does that affect climate change? Let's forget what happens to the conference.
Yeah, so I think it's important to focus on, as Navroz and the rest of us have been talking about, on the facts of the ground as opposed to the conferences. I agree completely. For most of the world, this is an elite phenomenon. It's not tangible to most people. And that means that when there are populist revolutions that are in some fundamental sense anti-elite revolutions, they're what in some very influential scholarship calls right-wing populism, meaning that they believe that the institutions have been taken over by elites who have lots of special agendas, human rights, environment, all this stuff. We need to get back to the roots. And that world is a dangerous world for people who worry about problems like climate change. And that problem, I believe, is not a solvable one. I think that's kind of intrinsic. I can speak now just from the US perspective. The political polarization in the United States seems likely to continue and get worse. There's a debate among political scientists as to why that's happening. And one of the most persuasive bodies of thinking that, in my view, is that it's rooted in inequality. That, and you see this playing out right now in the debate over tax that's happening in the United States, that when you set aside all the noise, what you have is one party that wants to reduce the size of government. This will be the most pervasive effect. The most harmful impact of the Trump administration will be on the de-skilling and de-spiriting of most of the US federal government. EPA, State Department, and so on. It's really, that part is what concerns me most, assuming we don't get into nuclear war, which would be bad for a lot of reasons. And so if you think this is rooted in inequality, then the polarization is going to continue. And I think that makes it really hard to take climate change as a climate topic and push on it. What it does mean, though, is that the incentive for the blue states, as we call them, the coasts, to go work on the problem, those incentives get stronger. And so my perspective on this is that the leadership states are now where the action is, and it's quite possible that they're going to do so much work on this problem that they are going to reduce the cost for everybody else, and they're going to make the politics of the problem easier. That's a hypothesis, far from proven, but I think that's the likely outcome.
Yeah, David has hit the nail on the head. I'll just add one small point that is somewhat more encouraging, is that the majority of economic activity in the United States actually happens in those coastal areas. So that is some point for optimism. But yes, I grew up in a rural area, and I can speak from it more anecdotally. Like it is such an elitist issue, and at some point, if the masses and not just the elites are going to think about climate change, we need to find some way to raise that from an elitist issue and get that and put that concern in other places. And my concern is that that only happens when it becomes very tangible, and that's not an optimistic point of view.
So Navroz,
Yeah,
just to piggyback, if I could just add to the question before you answer.
Okay.
Are we just staring at Kuznets? Essentially, we've got to develop first. I mean, that's the obvious sort of oversimplification.
or maybe it's not giving away too many secrets, but I believe the government is about to release one of its COP report, which enthusiastically cites Kuznets. So you have some sympathizers in positions of power. I'm not a big fan of the environmental Kuznets curve. I mean, I think it's a classic example of correlation being turned into causation, and there's nothing determinative about that. It's basically when you start mobilizing your politics. Hopefully, with this air story, we mobilize our domestic. There was an op-ed in the Indian Express today saying maybe this is the spark of a green politics in India. Who knows? But so I'm not sure that's necessarily the most useful way to talk about this.
I'm not
but
supporting it. I'm just
it's worth putting out as a question, because certainly, as the example I gave suggests, it's a way of thinking about it. It's a way of thinking about it. But I wanted to just sort of ask the question explore the issue that was embedded and dismissed in Anupam's question about the COP process, and I want to sort of make a little bit of a pitch to resurrect the importance of this process, right? I think the COP could have potentially been, the COP process was, the UNFCCC process was potentially destructive when the only objective was, let's try and divide up the pie and spend all our time fighting over how we divide up that pie. But with this shift in language, which basically says we move to a learning by doing model, right? It has a potentially much more useful role, and I think we've already seen that. So let's take India, for example. The reason India has a national action plan on climate change was because there was an important COP coming up in Copenhagen. That opened the door to a couple of enterprising bureaucrats, whom we all know well, to set up the National Solar Mission, the National Mission on Enhanced Energy Efficiency. It basically, so the COPs play a role in shaping the political opportunity structures domestically, right? And I think they don't get credit for doing that. They serve as a focal point, right? So this NASCAR set of initiatives is kind of piggybacking on the COP, and it's a way of networking across a lot of different cities and corporates and so on and so forth. So that focal point role, I think, is also important. It also serves as a way of shifting the geopolitics. The G2 meeting that David alluded to really changed climate politics. Wouldn't have happened if you didn't have the Paris meeting coming up. It sort of set a framework for thinking about this. Arguably, the Keep It in the Ground campaign that the NGOs came up with, which has led forced fossil fuel companies to internalize the costs of future carbon regulation, making them less, their stock price less valuable, essentially, or at least that's sort of the planned trajectory. That also is tied to sort of the creation of networks that were in part stimulated by conversations at these kinds of focal points at COP. So I think there's a lot of diffuse ways in which you have to think of that process. And now, with the shift in how the Paris Agreement is constructed, it is explicitly set up in that way, as opposed to a place where top-down decisions get made. So I wouldn't entirely dismiss that process. And just a last plug, we haven't talked about the COP much, but the design of it is potentially aimed at enhancing that, right? So the global stock takes, the technical expert review process, are not just meant to be sort of a global naming and shaming process, but also to mobilize domestic actors. So there's a really nice paper written by actually a Chinese-American scholar, Xinwan Dai, where she talks about the kinds of spaces that are open for victims of non-compliance and beneficiaries of compliance from these kinds of international agreements to pursue pathways with their own governments. So international agreements' biggest contribution, ironically, might be actually contributing to shaping domestic politics. And if some of the predictions we've made here about Mr. Trump come to pass, that may in fact be true.
Yeah, I would agree with Navroz's comments about the COP. I mean, we shouldn't throw it completely under the bus, and in some areas it's had a big impact. And in this model of thinking about the interaction between the international processes and the domestic, I will say one thing about this, which is for this model to work, this pledge and review model to work, you need to have a mechanism to do the stock taking in a way that's meaningful. I'm very skeptical that a process that requires, in essence, consensus, which doesn't mean unit veto, but close to it. I'm very skeptical that a process that's consensus-based decision-making can do that initially. It can do it once you know how it's done, but it's very hard to get started that way. And so this is why in my own writing in this area, I've been increasingly focused on the important role of volunteers, that what we should be looking for over the next few years is a few countries, and India could be one of them, China could be one of them, the EU must be one of them as a group, whatever's left of the EU by then, to put themselves forward and say, we want to have our policies and measures reviewed by peers from the other countries, so that the comfort level with that process goes up, and then the COP can codify that and turn it into formal procedures and so on. But the idea that the COP, or the meeting of the parties, would on their own be able to agree on something meaningful in this area without seeing demonstration cases, I think that's hard to see how that would happen.
We're just about out of time. Did you have a burning last question? And then I'll come back to the panel for any brief closing remarks, including forward-looking statements, which with any amount of caveats that you want.
Hi, I'm Sheila Ramasesha. I work in NIAS, Bangalore. I want to play devil's advocate here because we need counter arguments too. Okay, how far can renewable energies, even if we have 175, this is India specific question, 175 gigawatts of renewable, by 2022, how far can we go in terms of climate change with that? Because when you look outside, the renewable energies is not going to play any role there because we hardly get any sunshine in Delhi under such conditions. So should we aim at something else in addition to renewable energy to meet our climate change targets, or do we just run after the white elephant? And
I don't think that's a devil's advocate question. I think we heard in the previous panel.
No,
because
I brought in the
Sure.
current scenario outside, so which is
Absolutely.
very, very political.
No, it's absolutely true, and we've heard, I think David even mentioned it, emissions and climate change and even renewables are not the same. And there has been a preponderance of emphasis towards renewables. Navroz, David?
Please.
So we're agreeing with you in many ways.
I'm sure we're going to disagree on the emphasis, but what do we know? We know that a world that engages in deep decarbonization is a world that probably electrifies a lot. It's actually a very clean finding from the last IPCC report, essentially all the modeling work in this area. We know that there are many ways to generate electricity with zero or negative emissions. And we think we know, at least, and I believe this to be true, that competition between those zero and negative emission sources is essential to finding the lowest cost, most viable strategies. My guess is that the right solution set's going to vary depending on the country and the conditions and things like that. I think that the role that renewables plays in that has tended to be overplayed because the political support around renewables is usually greater than political support for anything else. I was involved with an effort that published a paper in June in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that was an attempt to try and introduce a little more realism around some of the wildly unrealistic claims about how quickly the world can go to renewables and what it would really cost, 100% renewables and what it would cost. But when you move from the bookend of 100%, which I think is infeasible, to zero, which is reckless, that there's a big range in there. And I'm just concerned that we keep all those options open.
Well, something I've written about in the past is that Indian energy policy has tended to be summarized by one phrase, which is all of the above, right? And that actually, by definition, is not a strategy, because you're not actually making any choices. So the narrative goes as follows: we're a chronically energy scarce society, therefore, and there's a big sort of leap there, we need to pursue everything simultaneously, which means that you actually dilute your efforts, you spread your resources, particularly your administrative resources, very thin, and you're not pursuing anything very, very effectively. So I don't think we've had that discussion in India yet. I mean, it's only, until recently we were talking about 1.5 billion tons of coal and 175 gigawatts of renewables simultaneously, without actually knowing how those were going to be rolled out, how they were going to, as well as 66 gigawatts of nuclear, which a former advisor energy declares is a God-given number in India. No government report can ever contradict that number. Even though we've basically made almost no progress towards it in 15 years. We're stuck at around 5, if I'm not mistaken. So the question about renewables, I think the answer to that question depends on a prior answer to this question. What is that strategy? How are we thinking about it? It is true that we have a lot more energy needs. We've looked at existing model studies in India. We're shortly to come out with a paper which is going to claim somewhat boldly that a likely upper bound for India's emissions by 2030 is a doubling of 2012 emissions. If that is the case, we will be less than half of China's 2015 emissions by 2030. Right? So it's actually, just to put it in context, and we will be lower on a per capita basis than today's global average. But if we are going to get to those kinds of those sorts of numbers, what is the mix, and what do we anticipate is going to happen, for example, in the gas market, right? What do we anticipate is going to happen with storage cost trends, and what do we think and I think, Rahul, you guys are doing some numbers trying to figure out what the actual cost might be of grid integration. So we have a lot of prior questions before we answer this question of whether 175 renewables makes sense or not. We have a long way to go, I think, in having a more sensible policy conversation in India.
So the flip side to your all of the above is just aim for the stars and maybe you'll reach the moon. So that's also been perhaps a mantra of some policy. Samantha, any last words?
Sure, I'll make a couple of closing points. The first point that I'll make is that President Trump is a blip. He's an unfortunate blip for the world, and as David pointed out, I hope he doesn't do anything truly reckless. But in terms of climate, it's unfortunate for the United States, but I think one thing that he has done is galvanized many at the subnational level in the United States and in other parts of the world in favor of the Paris Agreement. And so having something to be opposed to, I think in some ways has strengthened the Paris Agreement in some ways. The second point that I'll make is sort of the need of governments and policymakers to walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to think about the kinds of carbon reductions that we can make now, more shallow carbon reductions. And these are ones that often have co-benefits that make sense in other ways in terms of things like local air pollution. This is sort of the easy stuff, the low-hanging fruit that we can grab right now. But we also can't forget that at some point, if we're going to meet overall goals, prevent the worst outcomes of climate change, that we also need to think about the technology and the research and the things that we need to do to get us to deep decarbonization in the future. So we need to not just focus on the here and now and what's politically palatable, but the kind of research that gets us to where we need to go in the future.
Thank you. So I think, the expectations from COP23 are not exceptionally high from a lot of scholarly communities, is what I've heard. But at the same time, it's a part of the process. And at the end of the day, that process is probably equally or more important than the specifics of what get deliberated or what numbers or targets people are talking about. I think we could continue this for a long time, but we're well past our scheduled time, and I want to make sure everyone can leave before rush hour and pollution gets far worse. So thank you everyone for joining us, and please join me in thanking our panelists for a very stimulating discussion.